More on the Syrian situation. I'm joined by some experts. At the moment, I'm going to be speaking to Professor Clive Williams from the Strategic and Defence Studies area at the Australian National University. Professor Williams, very good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Now, the US airstrikes, the US has sort of reaffirmed that this is a one-off strike. It is not meaning that America is at war. Do you feel concerned, though, that there could be an escalation?
No, I don't think so. I think that this was clearly a measured response and a one-off, because if the US was really planning to do follow-up attacks, they would have prioritised surface-to-air missile sites, because obviously they'd be very dangerous for manned aircraft to go in and do attacks in Syria. So this was a message. You know, it was the air base where the attacks have been mounted from, and the aim was to destroy infrastructure and to minimise personnel losses. So that's why they gave 30 minutes warning.
Yeah, I'd also like to bring in Dr. John Bruni, who's joining us from SAGE, which is an intelligence and security consultancy from Adelaide. Dr. Bruni, thanks for joining us. We were just talking about the Americans have very much reiterated that this is a one-off retaliatory action. Do you believe that it won't escalate the entire situation?
Look, there's always the law of unintended consequences when one starts off to do a military strike of this nature. But I think that at this point in time, the Trump administration would have to be very, very careful. After all said and done, we understand that Donald Trump still wants to accomplish his key foreign policy plank, and that is good relations with Russia. If this military strike leads to further strikes or an escalation in tensions against the Assad regime, we can probably guarantee that that idea of having good relations with Russia will be on the back burner for quite some time to come.
All right, Clive Williams, it is interesting bringing into question perhaps the relationship between the United States and Russia, which of course has been on the front pages for other reasons, Clive Williams. Yes. But we know some of Russia's responses today has been President Putin has called America this act of aggression. They've broken international law. How do you see this relationship issue, Clive Williams?
Well, I think that apparently Trump had spoken to Putin as well about this issue earlier. So I think that obviously Putin had to react, because it is to some extent an affront to Russia, because of course Russia being Syria's main ally. But I think that they would also have been pleased about the fact that they had the 30 minutes warning, and that presumably no Russians or Russian aircraft were damaged in the attack. So I think that probably they'll say, well, you know, this was the US trying to make itself more of a player in a situation where it had been marginalised before.
All right. Do you think, though, that means that Russia will not retaliate further than those words that President Putin has used?
I don't think it's in Russia's interest to push the issue further now. And of course, both Russia and the United States have a common interest in trying to destroy Islamic State. And that's another reason why the United States can't really get too far offside with Assad's forces, because they're going to need some Syrian cooperation in the taking of Raqqa.
Yeah. Dr. Bruni, do you see this as something where, so maybe Russia stays at those angry words, those retaliatory words, doesn't go any further, but this strike does seem to have very strong support within the United States, including from Hillary Clinton?
Yes, it's interesting about that, and I suppose one has to wonder whether or not the political situation that Donald Trump faces domestically in the United States had something to do with the timing of this attack. You know, this isn't the first time chemical weapons have been used. The Obama administration very carefully navigated its way through a crisis with when the Syrian government allegedly had struck the southern suburbs of Damascus with chemical weapons in 2013. So but now we have to wonder.
You say he trod carefully. I mean, he threatened to have some retaliation, and then he pulled back, much to the horror of many people in the world.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I suppose if you were to be able to be in his shoes for good reasons. I mean, the Syrian conflict is an extraordinarily complex conflict. We've got many contenders on the field of battle, and it's now complicated by the fact that the Russians had intervened in 2015. that we have Iranian forces on the ground as well, and also the southern Lebanese terrorist group Hezbollah offering the government forces of Assad the kind of support that it needs to sustain itself. Now, if any of those groups were to be struck, either deliberately or by accident, from American missiles, you know, we were talking earlier about the idea of retaliation. Yes, I believe that there will be some form of retaliation for any such strike. Now, you know, but going back to the American domestic situation, had, for instance, Trump been able to manage his entry into the White House in more auspicious manners, I'm wondering whether or not he would have lashed out on Syria in this strike.
All right, well,
I think that what it does...
Go ahead.
No.
Yeah, Clive Williams, let me jump in there then with you. I mean, do you accept this, that perhaps the domestic political situation Donald Trump found himself in had something to do with this strike?
Well, I think so. I mean, he's had very low popular ratings, of course, and in the past, where an American president has launched a cruise missile strike, their ratings have immediately gone up. And I can remember when Clinton did the same thing into Iraq. You know, he was on poor ratings and suddenly they shot up. Americans like somebody who acts powerfully. The danger, of course, is that now that Trump might think this is a good weapon to use, and if he was to do the same thing against North Korea, of course, North Korea would be much more likely to retaliate than Syria would.
Yeah, this is a slightly cynical view. I mean, I know there are people who agree with both of what you're saying, but I mean, this is a very serious situation, launching airstrikes into this already incredibly complicated situation in Syria. And yet both of you, in your sort of expert assessment, feel that there is some domestic politics at play here, that he might have done it to become more popular.
Well, I think there's that danger, and you know, hopefully it won't lead to him using the force lever more often. But as I said earlier, this was a strike that was fairly measured. It was intended to do damage to infrastructure. It was not intended to do any damage to people.
Yeah.
And it was there to send a message not to do any more chemical strikes, and I think that Assad obviously should take that on board.
All right, it does also show, doesn't it, John Bruni, I'd like both of your views on this, it also shows a slight change in Donald Trump's whole view on Syria. I mean, he told the world a few days ago that seeing those photos of the children had changed his view, but he had at one point said Syria's not America's problem. And now we also have, you know, US Secretary of State Tillerson saying that, I guess as part of the justification for the strike today, that Russia had failed in its 2013 agreement to secure the Syrian chemical weapons. John Bruni?
Yes, look, it's interesting about that. I mean, and again, there are some unsubstantiated reports right now that even question whether or not this chemical attack was actually delivered by the Syrian government forces, although I think the good evidence is that there are, you know, that has been the case. However, without verification, it becomes very difficult. We have to understand that essentially both sides of this war are armed with chemical weapons. So if it's good for one side to be punished for the use of chemical weapons, and these chemical weapons are not always stored in one place but can be moved around, then what happens if the other side, namely the Syrian rebels, were to stage a chemical weapon attack, and would there be international approbation against them for doing so? And then how would we ever be able to prove it? So it does raise some very complicated issues indeed. Yeah.
Clive Williams, I mean, in a sense, what was the thinking behind the US? I know we've discussed a couple of the issues, but do they actually think that they will get President Assad to stop using chemical weapons when clearly he'd promised to hand over a stockpile some time ago and he's kept that stockpile? Or was it just pure retaliation to show that the world does not want to put up with this?
Well, I think that the experts seem to think that after the stockpile was supposed to have been destroyed by June 2014, that there was probably something like 1% that was still left, and that may have been due to mistakes or bad stock keeping or whatever. And, you know, there's always the possibility that in this particular strike that they somehow mixed up one chemical rocket with 3 others, because according to the reports that came from the ground, there was 4 rockets came in, 3 of them were explosive, and one had gas in it. And so, you know, it's not a logical way to use a weapon from a military point of view. So I just wonder whether it was a mistake and that they didn't actually intend to do a chemical attack.
Oh, really? Because I was going to say, what do you make of the explanation earlier in the week where the, you know, Syria and its ally Russia claimed it was the Syrian military bombing a chemical weapons plant, I think they said, of the rebels?
Well, they certainly wouldn't want to own up to having launched a chemical weapon by mistake.
Did that make any sense to you?
Well, not really, because the agent that was apparently used, and it's got to be analysed properly, of course, but it seemed very consistent with sarin, and I don't think that the rebel groups would be able to make up something as sophisticated as that. They're more likely to use chlorine or and other forms of acid gases, that sort of thing, rather than something that is a binary agent, which would take some degree of sophistication to manufacture.
All right, so both of you don't really expect there to be further risks to either the United States or the world, if I'm reading what you said properly. John Bruni?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I think that there's always going to be a risk of escalation. Again, this is a very complex battle space. Now that Trump has intervened militarily once, he set a precedent. Will he do so again? That, of course, is going to be for the gods to decide. And again, we'll have to wait and see how his political situation vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin plays itself out as well. So, yeah, it's fraught.
All right, Clive Williams, if I could just finish with you. I mean, it's not necessarily your area normally of expertise, but does it really push the crucial meeting between President Xi and President Trump sort of to the background?
Well, I don't know. I think that obviously the president will be worrying about the issues in terms of North Korea. So, you know, that might come into it, that if Trump is prepared to launch cruise missiles against Syria for this kind of activity, he may well see this as being an opportunity to flex his muscles a bit with North Korea as well.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, we do have to leave it there. Dr. John Bruni and Professor Clive Williams, I thank you for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.